My name is Michael Tellinger, and I live in South Africa, where I've been researching the ancient vanished civilizations of Southern Africa and making some interesting discoveries that connect this civilization to much of the Sumerian texts and the information we get in the Sumerian transcripts, specifically to the activities of the Annunaki here in what is referred to as the Abzu, which I believe is referring to Southern Africa. And I've discovered some interesting ancient tools and artifacts and thousands, if not millions, of gold mines to show that the vanished civilization here was very actively participating in mining gold. And it goes back to more than 200,000 years ago. And it fits perfectly with much of Zecharia Sitchin's work that he's been writing about for many years. And I believe I've discovered the physical evidence to support much of what Sitchin has written. And that's very exciting, not only because we can now make a real connection between the Sumerian texts and some of the Sumerian entities and the gods and the deities, and also link it to ancient African knowledge and African tradition that is virtually parallel to the Sumerian texts that has been held by the African knowledge keepers for thousands of years. My research has shown that there are more than 10 million mysterious stone structures, or as we've come to call them affectionately, the stone circles. And these stone circles are not what have been thought, what archaeologists and historians have thought before. Everybody assumed that these were dwellings for people, and that turns out not to be the case. In fact, it is now clear that these stone circles are actually part of a giant energy grid that generated huge amounts of energy by tapping into the sound frequencies of Mother Earth and converting this into huge amounts of energy that was used for the gold mining and probably many other activities that we have not yet identified. Now, to this effect, I've managed to do some very interesting electronic and scientific measurements inside the stone circles to support this scientifically, and not just because I've got a warm, fuzzy feeling in my stomach about it, but also it also is consistent with the tools and the artifacts that I've been finding and collecting that suggest that these ancient people that lived here mining gold had a very advanced knowledge of the laws of nature that we are only now beginning to understand. Well, that's a very important question, and the answer to that is actually very interesting, and it goes back 500 years already, because the stone circles have been reported more than 500 years ago in the late 1400s by the Portuguese explorers when they came around the Cape of Good Hope, and when they landed on what is today the coast of Mozambique, and they entered Southern Africa and South Africa and Zimbabwe. And they came across these stone circles and these stone structures and the ruined cities of Southern Africa, and it is well recorded in the Portuguese records from the late 1800s and the early 1500s, and they talk extensively about the African tribes that were living around and among the stone circles, and they made it very clear that these African tribes told them that they did not build these stone structures, and they did not know who built these stone structures. And then it was reignited again in the mid-1800s by German explorers Mauch, and then other British explorers that came here in the mid to late 1800s and the early 1900s. And they did all kinds of research around the stone circles of South Africa and Zimbabwe and also Botswana. And several phenomenal books have been written on this, but they all sort of ended in the early 1900s, only to be revived in the 70s by several South African authors. But the assumption was always made that these were dwellings for people. And that's been the mistake that all these historians and archaeologists have made. And I find it fascinating because not only were their assumptions very obviously wrong, but many of the archaeological reports that you find clearly state that the original structures did not have any doors or entrances. And this was a huge problem because if you've got a dwelling, then you're going to have doors and entrances. So they sort of recognized that there were no doors and entrances, but then they, just as quickly as they recognized it, they ignored it and carried on assuming that they were dwellings for people. We learned, first of all, and it was really sparked off by the fact that, when we used to take our GPS into Adam's calendar, and just for your viewers that don't know anything about this or Adam's calendar is an ancient calendar site, a stone monolithic calendar site that goes back about 280,000 years, based on my most recent calculations and evaluations, to the very origins of humankind. And Adam's calendar is actually known by ancient African knowledge keepers as Inzalo Yelanga, or the birthplace of the sun, where the gods created the human race. And that's very interesting because it's very consistent with the Sumerian text that I mentioned before. But we first started realizing that there were some strange anomalies going on when we started going into Adam's calendar with a GPS, and realizing that you lose GPS signal when you go inside the circular sort of area of the calendar site. And yet there's no distinct circle or anything. It's just an imaginary circle inside the calendar precinct. And the moment you go in there, you lose GPS and it starts to scramble and show you all kinds of, it keeps changing direction and showing you. So we realized that something strange is going on. And this was then confirmed in some of the stone circles as well. The moment you go into the stone circle, you lose GPS. There was a guy that used to work for the Centec, the South African satellite installation company, and he went there with his very advanced measurement device and started measuring sound frequencies that run into the gigahertz coming out of the walls inside the stone circles. That completely boggled his mind, and also electromagnetic waves and electromagnetic activity that was coming out of the walls. And all of this was happening inside the stone circle. He only measured one stone circle to start off with. And then he got very excited because he thought, oh my goodness, if this is coming out of the walls in the stone circles, I know how to create an energy device. I know how to use this to create energy. The lowest we measured runs at about 11.5 gigahertz, somewhere around there. And that's just insane because, you don't pick up sound frequencies in nature at those kind of levels. And it just becomes a huge dilemma for scientific evaluation, how this is possible. And then also, remember, there's nothing happening outside the stone circle. The moment you start measuring inside, your recordings and your measurements go off the charts. And the climax was reached at Adam's calendar, where we measured, the device could not measure the sound frequencies. It stopped because it couldn't measure as high as they were. And the highest we measured was at about 375 gigahertz, at which point the device sort of failed, couldn't measure anything higher. But according to the guy that measured it, he claims that it actually went a lot higher. And then also the other measurements that I mentioned were the electromagnetic fields that we measured. And sometimes they run horizontally inside the stone circles, and sometimes they run vertically out of the ground into the sky. When I discovered that the stones inside the walls have a very specific property, and the property is that they make beautiful sounds. I've been calling them stones that ring like bells. You realize that this thing really rings like a bell, and it reverberates for quite a long time. And that was a life-changing moment for me, because suddenly, with my understanding of sound and music and resonance and frequency, I realized that all these stone structures are not about dwellings, they're not about homes for people in ancient times, but they're actually about sound and using sound in some way to generate some form of energy. And that's when suddenly the fact that they had no doors and entrances became very important, because I realized we're dealing with energy generating devices and not dwellings. And this is the very important dividing line. Now, we're facing about 10 million or more energy generating devices that lie scattered throughout South Africa, Zimbabwe, Botswana, and Mozambique. And so it is a vast, vanished civilization that we know absolutely nothing about. So, as I said, the purpose of the stone circles was to generate energy. That's why they built them. How they built them is a very interesting story. I assumed they would have used some sort of a way to recognize the cymatic patterns of the sound coming through the surface of Mother Earth at each point where a stone circle has been constructed. And the reason I say this is because every stone circle is actually a very distinct representation of a cymatic pattern. You know, cymatics is the science of sound manifesting in physical form. For those people that don't know what I mean by cymatics, is when you put sand on a metal plate and you put a sound frequency through a speaker underneath the metal plate. Every sound frequency will give you a very specific and unique shape and a pattern based on that sound frequency. What I discovered is that each one of these stone circles is actually a cymatic pattern that represents the sound frequency of Mother Earth at that particular point. So, in essence, what's happening there is that the way the stones have been accumulated in the stone circle at that point creates a plug point, an energetic plug point that resonates and vibrates based on the sound of Mother Earth at that point, and then amplifies that frequency and creating very powerful electromagnetic fields, because it's amplifying it into gigahertz of sound. And this is where we just don't understand that kind of technology. The reason I believe all these stone structures are here is to generate the energy that was then used for the gold mining to get the gold out of the ground. And this is really where the obsession for gold can be connected to our human history, because it's impossible to separate humans and gold. I mean, every ancient culture, every ancient civilization, even the Bible talks about gold. I mean, in Genesis 2, in the Bible, when Adam was still alone on planet Earth, it's not Adam that starts to talk about gold, but it's God that comes to Adam and starts to tell Adam about this place called Havilah, where there is gold. It's important for us to understand one thing, and I know that this is going to be tough for some people to deal with, but unfortunately these are the things that we have to, as we grow, we're like children in the universe. We're like the babies of the universe on this planet. Suddenly we're looking up at the sky and we're seeing infinity, and in that infinity we imagine an infinite number of civilizations with infinite number of different levels of advancement, and this is what we have to come to terms with. Unfortunately, for those that don't want to come to terms with it, it's going to be a tough journey. But this is what we face. So we're now joining the universal community of beings, and because now we're starting to really look at this and reach out to these beings and open ourselves to these beings on levels of higher consciousness and so forth. So Adam's calendar is just like all ancient structures. It's not just a calendar. We call it a calendar because it tells you every day of the year. It's still very accurate if you want to use it. You can tell every day of the year by the shadow of the sun when it sets. But that's just a built-in feature. Remember that the ancients understood light and they understood sound. very, very well, much better than what we understand light and sound. So they used sound and light as the primary tools to create machines. Just like all this technology we're using today, you're talking to me across Africa and across the Mediterranean. And what are we using? We're using silicon-based technology, right? The most advanced technology is silicon-based technology. Well, guess what? All the stones in the world, especially the granites and the sandstones, are between 70 and 90% silica. It's silicon-based technology. Quartzite is silica, 90% or more silica. Crystals is silica, crystalline. And then we start realizing that stones contain memory. The silica in the stones has the capacity to transfer information and store information and act as a machine, as a very advanced tool, a highly technological tool, just like our silicon chips in our computers that I'm talking to you on right now. So all these ancient structures, from Stonehenge to the pyramids to Adam's calendar, are not just little interesting structures. They are machines. They are huge machines that are triggered by sound and by light. And this is why they are all aligned to the movement of the sun, to the solstices and the equinoxes and the rise of the sun here and the setting of the sun over there. Because when the sun hits the machine from a certain angle, it acts like a trigger to make the machine do a specific thing and perform a specific task. And remember that light is also attached to a sound frequency. So every light frequency has a sound frequency attached to it as well. So they're using light and sound combinations to trigger and activate these ancient machines to perform certain tasks. Now, most of these seem to be energy generating devices that we still don't know what they were doing with that energy. But at Adam's calendar, it seems from the way that the energy flows that we have a horizontal very powerful electromagnetic field that runs horizontally, and then an electromagnetic field that comes out of it, and it spirals between the two central calendar stones. It spirals out into the sky. It suggests that we have something like a teleportation device or a transportation or a transmutation device. And I suggested, in some of the presentations that they were using that to beam the gold up, like they do in Star Trek, where they put the people in that little chamber and they beam them up, Scotty. So that's what I suggested. They brought the gold to Adam's calendar, and the calendar was actually receiving all the energy from all the energy generating devices around here. So this is why it is a much stronger energy device and a slightly different shape, configuration, the toroid field that it creates, and the torus, and it's possible that they use it for getting the gold off the ground, off the earth, somewhere, wherever they chose to send it to. The only answer I have for that is that something must have happened. Something must have been done with the people when they died to remove them or to burn them and I think maybe this is where some of the ancient cultures have the tradition of burning the dead so that there's nothing left of the body. And it's possible that this was what happened in ancient times. But I also have from various psychic revelations and past life regressions from various people, including my own past life regression that I did. I got the information that they actually, when the people died, because they didn't live very long, they died actually quite young, because they used to clone them for the first few thousand years. They cloned the beings as slaves for the gold mines, and they were born as adults and were trained and learned how to walk and how to understand instructions and operate the tools, and they went to work in the gold mines. And they died very young. They probably only lived about 30 years, if that, maybe even younger. And they were larger than we are. They were probably the size of that femur that you saw in the video clip, possibly, because that was found in a mine in Namibia. They converted the bones and the material of the human bones into crystalline structure that they used as crystals that were imbued with human consciousness, that were more powerful crystals than just ordinary crystals that came out of the ground. The dating of this is really obviously very difficult, and we're working with a dating technique that is very wide, because there is no real dating that we can do that is accurate. What we can do is looking at every possible clue and every possible piece of evidence that point us in the direction that suggests how old this may be. And first of all, the fact that we know nothing about it clearly tells us that it's very old. It's not just a few thousand years old, it's many thousands of years old. The other interesting thing is that 90% of these stone structures actually lie covered beneath the soil and the sand, and mostly on tops of mountains and down the sides of mountains, and there's sea sand that covers them, often seashells and fossilized fish that we find on top of mountains inside these stone structures. So I've reached the conclusion that this is a vanished civilization that was destroyed probably by the so-called Great Flood. And the Great Flood that most people refer to seems to be positioned somewhere between 11,000 and 14,000 years ago. I mean, how accurate that is, we don't really know, but somewhere along that line, we got this Great Flood that some people would say is the biblical flood that destroyed the whole world. Now, that seems to be consistent with the fact that 90% of these stone structures are covered by sand, seashells, fossilized fish, and so forth. But then there are many other interesting Sumerian texts and translations that point to certain places here in southern Africa. The one is a translation by Zechariah Sitchin long before, I mean, he died before we actually knew about this. But it talks about the Annunaki, the Annunakis gods in great detail, how they arrived on earth, how they came looking for gold, and how they created the slave species, or the Lulu Amelu, to help them mine for the gold. And here we have a vast gold mining empire that with millions of gold mines and millions of energy devices to power and drive these gold mines. So I believe we have a right to assume that this is most likely what the Sumerian texts refer to as the Abzu, where the gold came from. And then obviously there's a whole story with King Solomon and the gold mines that he got all his gold from. Huge question as to where these gold mines were. I believe that we're actually looking at southern Africa, most likely Zimbabwe, where King Solomon's gold mines were. And then finally, the stone tools that I've been collecting are a very clear indication that we're dealing with something extremely old, because the stone is a very specific kind of stone. It's known as hornfels, and it's a very hard metamorphosized quartzite, and these are the stones that ring like bells. There are also other stones that are used in some of these stone circles that are actually dolerite, but it's a very dense dolerite, which to an untrained eye looks just like the hornfels. And incidentally, the dolerite also rings beautifully like a bell. And when you shape the hornfels into tools and artifacts, they are black on the inside. And when you leave it lying exposed, it slowly starts to grow this skin called patina on the rock. And that patina grows incredibly slowly. It grows several thousand years per microscopic layer. By the time you can see the patina with your eyes, it's already several thousand years old. So when you find tools and artifacts that were sculptured or molded from this hornfels stone, and these artifacts are covered by 1 or 2 or 5 millimeters of patina, you know you're dealing with something extremely old. It is at least 100,000 years old, probably closer to 300,000 years old. And there's very little argument you can throw against that. These are probably the oldest tools and artifacts that we found on Earth. But these are not the kind of stone axes that you find from the Stone Age, the typical stone axes from primitive man. We found fire, we live in a cave. No, we're dealing with beautiful tools, conical what I call the cone-shaped tools, or the ice cream cone phenomenon that I've been finding as common denominators in South Africa, at the Bosnian pyramid, with the Mayas. In England, I found just recently cone-shaped tools found in an ancient mine. Isn't that interesting? In an ancient mine, cone-shaped tools. Ed Leeds-Skalnin, that built Coral Castle in southern Florida, was seen to use cone-shaped tools. The Egyptian used cone-shaped tools. Suddenly you realize that these cone-shaped tools are a common denominator in all these advanced ancient cultures. And this is critical information. And then, one final beautiful example of how old this may be comes from Zecharia Sitchin's translation, which I believe describes Adam's calendar. And there's a translation in one of his books that says, 40 Shar after arriving on Earth, Enki built himself a special place of observing on the edge of a cliff in the deep Abzu. That description is virtually identical description for Adam's calendar, or which we now can call Enki's calendar. And if you calculate according to Sitchin's calculations, 40 Shar, 1 Shar being 3,600 years, you multiply 40 by 3,600, and you subtract it from the 435,000 years that Sitchin claims is when the Annunaki arrived on Earth, you get about 285,000 years. And that's interesting. That's a very interesting number, because it fits perfectly into the mitochondrial DNA studies that suggest that humanity first appeared on planet Earth between 200 and 350,000 years ago. So everything stays consistent. All ancient belief systems, ancient religions, and even the Bible that talks about the Elohim and the Nephilim and the Seraphim and the Zamzumim and the Gibberim and the Emim, all these ancient beings that were giants that walked among the humans on earth, and whom the humans feared and obeyed. And all ancient cultures talk about the gods that come down from the sky. Most of the ancient cultures talk that humanity was created by the gods and had to serve the gods. And the Anunnaki are the Anuna gods of the Sumerian texts that Sitchin writes in great detail about, and the gods of heaven and earth, and that's why he calls them the Annunaki, gods of heaven and earth, ki being earth, and how they came here looking for gold. They found gold in huge quantities, and they needed help. So they created a slave species out of the genetic material that they found in a creature on planet Earth, most likely Homo erectus or some other creature like that may no longer be among us, and themselves, their own DNA. And they blended and molded this DNA to make a creature that was intelligent enough to understand their commands and their instructions, but not smart enough to question their authority. So they called it a Lulu Amelu, a primitive worker. In Sitchin's work, he shows you how the Sumerian texts call it the Adamu. And once again, we have an interesting connection to the biblical texts and other ancient texts, and with origins of humanity and Adam as being the first created being by the gods. What becomes clear is that these so-called mythological stories were actually real events in human history, but then they were twisted by those that are controlling the planet today. So the last thing they want humanity to know is that we actually have a very interesting history, and this is why the control systems are so fiercely imposed on humanity, and using religion primarily as the most fear tactic to make people believe certain things that are not necessarily so. So scientific proof is all around us. I think it's important to start making a choice whether you start believing the ancient civilizations and the ancient texts, or whether you start believing modern historians and modern politicians with their modern agendas, who are controlled by the banking families, who clearly just want to keep control of this planet and keep people dumbed down and keep them as dumb and as obedient as possible. Now, these are different times in human history. Okay, we can't impose our own belief systems. We can't impose our own views of the world and the universe. We see it today in this oppressed and ignorant world we live in today. We can't impose those viewpoints on what was happening on planet Earth 100,000 or 300,000 years ago, because it was a different place, different time, different things were going on. Different energy fields, different densities, possibly different beings of higher consciousness and lower consciousness being involved in battles against each other that we can only read about and hear about in ancient mythological texts. We have so much contact with aliens and extraterrestrial life. If you stop watching CNN and BBC and RT, you'll find out how much contact we have. But unfortunately, the contact that we have is never reported on in the mainstream media. So the people that only watch mainstream media will forever remain ignorant, and they'll remain skeptical because, if they don't see it on CNN, then it can't be true, But they're told every other lie and deception and propaganda, and they believe that. But when people start talking about their experience with aliens and going to other planets and aliens coming to visit them and whatever experiences millions and millions of people have had experiences with aliens, that is just ignored and scoffed upon, and these people are ridiculed. They're made to look like idiots, like they lost their mind. So there's contact with ETs all the time. And then also remember that our understanding of the nature of reality is so restricted compared to what is really going on in all of creation. There are different levels, different dimensions that life and energy can exist on. So, when we talk about this planet and this reality that we face, it is from our very naive and ignorant and narrow-minded perspective that we talk about science and evidence and so forth, because the moment something shifts out of phase, out of the frequency in our own reality, when it shifts out of phase with our own frequencies of observation, we can't see it, we can't detect it, it no longer exists. Look, all you have to do is look at quantum physics. It's more than 100 years old already. And where quantum physicists started saying, hold on, the nature of our reality is very different from what we thought it was. This physical world is actually not physical at all. And in fact, that it is the observer that projects and creates the outcome of what they're observing. And that we can move and change the outcome of something with our mind and our thoughts. And then you start reading ancient cultures and ancient texts, and that's exactly what ancient civilizations talk about. And that's what Jesus talks about when he says, with faith, you can move mountains. Not that he doesn't mean believe in me and faith in God in the clouds in the sky. He means with your thoughts, with your mind, with understanding, with your thoughts, you can move mountains. You can be like I. You can do anything. And so we get these clues that get given to us by the masters and the prophets throughout our human history that have tried to tell us this information without saying it in a way that we want to understand it today. And all you have to do is just read it differently. If you interpret it in the way that it was explained at the time, it makes complete sense. And it all brings it down, everything from all ancient cultures. Brings down everything to resonance, vibration, harmonics, and frequency. Sound being the primordial source of everything in the universe. And before people jump to conclusion about what sound is, we don't understand what sound is in this reality. We have no idea. What we do know is a fraction of what sound is, how it works, and what happens to sound when you propel it beyond the speed of light. And that's a very important bit of information to a lot of your listeners, that sound travels beyond the speed of light. This is a very important breakthrough that was made in science and physics already in 2005, I believe, in Tennessee, USA. And this is one of the best kept secrets in science. The Latvian American who built Coral Castle single-handedly. It's impossible for anybody to do that single-handedly. And he used some sort of technology to levitate these rocks. He also carved them perfectly, made them into weird shapes like chairs and and all kinds of sculptures and statues that's impossible for a man to make on his own in such a short space of time, with no help whatsoever. And I believe that he discovered the principles of propelling sound through vortex technology, and utilizing the distortion of the gravity fields that happen around sound that's propelled in the Caesar technology. And this is what I believe the cone-shaped tools were used for, to actually speed up and propel the sound and turn the sound into Caesar technology that distorts gravity around itself, and you can then move objects with that distorted gravity field. So it's very important to draw the distinction between using sound waves to levitate objects, which I've shown in some of my presentations. That is the incorrect way of using sound, because they're using the movement of molecules of air and just the compression waves to levitate small little objects and light objects. But you'll never be able to do that with heavy objects or anything heavier than, maybe 100 or 200 grams or half a kilo. After that, you need a very, very powerful source to generate these very powerful sound waves to move the molecules very, very violently and create a standing wave inside a chamber that then holds the object inside the standing wave. That's the incorrect way of using sound. But when you start propelling sound and using the Caesar technology, now we're talking with a completely different, and hypersound. This is another new word that I've just recently been given by a German scientist that's written a paper on it called hypersound. For the past 5 years, I have been pretty much sidelined by the mainstream academic community, and in the last year things have are changing quite quickly, and I think it's changing everywhere, because suddenly a lot of people like me who are doing sort of research in areas that have been frowned upon by mainstream academia are making breakthrough discoveries in technology that is forcing mainstream academia to look at it, because I now no longer talk about aliens and little green men that come to Earth, all that, because that's how they normally want to make you look like an idiot, because you talk about little green men and he's a bit cuckoo, So now I'm talking about scientific evidence of advanced technology that is the front line of new research and the area of interest for scientists around the world. So I've been inundated with emails from scientists from all over the world, including France and Germany and America and Japan and all over the world, that are interested in the sound element of this research, because it seems to be sound is becoming sound resonance and frequency and scalar waves and scalar technology seems to be the leading edge of scientific research right now. And the fact that we've got physical evidence of more than 10 million energy devices that were built 300,000 years ago, I mean, that is enough to get any scientist excited, Absolutely, there's no doubt about that. And there are various reasons I say this. First of all, I know this from the number of people that are watching my videos and my presentations. It goes up all the time. I'm not the only one. There are many other people like me that are sharing views and information of higher consciousness that talks to the heart of the people and not to the ego mind of the people. And people, once you talk to the heart of people, it resonates with them, because remember, we are resonating with the prime resonance frequency of the creator, of everything in creation resonates in symbiotic harmony. If it doesn't resonate in harmony, it cannot be part of this giant creation. So when you start talking truth to the people, it resonates in their hearts, and they know it, and it feels good, and they follow that instinct, and more people are prepared to follow that instinct. They're no longer afraid, because they've been pushed so far to the edge that they can be pushed no more. And I think that is the reason why so many people are waking up and are prepared to take steps now that they were not prepared to take 5 years ago. And so that's one reason why I know that this consciousness is exploding. But also, secondly, because we know this from genetic studies. And if you follow the work of people like William Brown and other geneticists that have studied what's happening to our DNA, there's very clear scientific evidence that our DNA is evolving. And we're using more and more of our so-called junk DNA. And myself, like many other researchers, believe that that is actually the important part of your DNA, is that so-called junk DNA, 97 or more % of your DNA. And that is the part that has been made dormant by the Anunnaki. And this is really, really important information. When Enki was creating the Lulu Amelu, or the primitive species, to be the worker in the gold mines, he knew that if he had created a species that could not contemplate its own consciousness and could not rise and evolve its own consciousness, he would be creating a great sin against all of creation. He would be breaking what Star Trek has been calling the prime directive. He'd be interfering with the rise of consciousness and the evolution of a species, and that is not permitted in the greater universe of conscious beings. And he created the DNA so that at a specific point in time, the human DNA would be activated and allow human beings to rapidly rise in consciousness. And I believe that is the Mayan prophecy. The 2012 prophecy that is when the activation comes that activates the human DNA to start feeding back on itself and opening up the information that's been encoded in there, like a computer program, because that's really all it is. Our DNA is just a very advanced computer program, and this is, I believe, what's happening at a rapid rate. Our DNA is allowing us now to reach levels of higher consciousness, and this is why more and more people are waking up going, wow, suddenly I'm ready for more information.